Okay, good afternoon and good evening and good morning to you, wherever you are. And welcome to the first South Asia Initiative event of the new academic year. This quarter, for a range of reasons, we'll be focusing on the theme of strategic competition between India and China and the US. And to kick us off, we are taking the excellent and fleeting opportunity to talk with Professor Sinderpal Singh. Sinderpal is currently in the US as the McCain Fulbright Scholar in Residence at the US Naval Academy in Annapolis. He's normally based in Singapore, where he is an award-winning teacher and researcher. He runs the South Asia program at the Nanyang Technological University, and you can read more about his work and his bio on our event website. But I want to focus today on his work in progress. He is currently writing a book on India's approach to the Indian Ocean region. So we're going to take this opportunity to focus our discussion on that region. It's an area, I think, that India has traditionally exercised strategic leadership, and it's guarded that leadership pretty closely. But it's now facing more and more challenges from China, and accordingly, more and more incentives to work with partners, including the US. So this is a topic I'm very excited about. So let me say, Cinder, welcome.
Thanks, Arsene. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Of course. Now, as always, we have a lot to get through. So let me just make one more housekeeping announcement. If you out there in Zoom land have questions, please do not hesitate to share them. Send them in, but use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Time is very short. We have a maximum of 1 hour, so I will be ruthless. So please keep your questions short and to the point. Now, let's begin. As I said, we're discussing strategic competition in the Indian Ocean region today. And so to begin, Cinder, if you would, let's start by setting the scene by tracking India's trajectory of its approach to the region since, say, the 1990s, over the last 30 years or so. What were its main strategic concerns then in the 90s, and what are its concerns now, today?
Thanks, Arsene. So I think if you look at the literature on India-China competition in the context, in the maritime space especially, then I think one has to look at Raja Mohan's Samudra Manthan work, right? In a sense, it's a work, whether you agree or disagree, you have to negotiate it. So maybe I can start off a bit with that and then try to reflect upon what Raja said in that work. So if you look at Samudra Manthan, one of the key points is that two things are happening at the same time. The first thing that's happening, I guess Raja's book's a bit different because Raja's doing China and India at the same time, right? And then trying to see what's happening in the Indian Ocean and the other maritime spaces, joining it, and also what's happening with India-China competition. So I think one of the key points Raja makes is, as there is a very important causal relationship between India's liberalizing economy, joining the global economic system, and then its need to then look outwards in terms of sea lines of communication. And in a sense, he says there are parallels between India and China. As you become, both countries need huge amounts of energy supplies to fund national development, its economy. And so both countries then get fixated about and concerned about the eventuality where these energy resources are held ransom by a third partner. So in a sense, the Indian kind of 1990s onwards, you can see this kind of logic coming to the fore. Of course, as Raja also says, and many others have said, Rajiv Gandhi's late 1980s period also is very important because that's where you see a kind of reawakening of the kind of Indian maritime imaginary. So we have this huge debate, which you obviously know, that for a long time, besides K.M. Panikkar early on, of the three services, the Navy was the poor sibling of the tree, because India had, what some people say, a continental curse because of the nature of its relationship, Pakistan, China, 62, etc. So I think from 1990s onwards, there's this move to look outwards, secure sea lines of communication, thinking about energy supplies. And then I think if you look at that part of that period as well, the other interesting that's happening is, and I think Raja tries to capture this, how people as well, people like Tanvi Madan in her excellent book talk about some of this as well, that you come to a point where India and China think that there needs to be some kind of, I guess, use word CBMs, or more importantly, some kind of understanding that, we don't want increased strategic rivalry to come to a point where it affects both our national economies, our development plans, and there's some progress in that. But of course, as we know, as we move to about 2000 onwards, that takes a dive. We can come to that later. So I think that's the kind of trajectory you see. So late 80s, I think some Southeast Asian countries actually were a bit concerned in the late 1980s for the end of the Cold War that India was expanding its naval footprint, especially in the Bay of Bengal. And from 1990s onwards, I think that kind of, those questions about naval modernization start to come right center into Indian defense thinking.
Yeah, that's really, it's interesting you bring that up. I remember this famous cover story and cover image of Time magazine of an Indian warship, and a cover story about India flexing its muscles, building its capacity in the Indian Ocean and flexing its muscles, and being a potential threat at the time. But now let's fast forward, let's bring it to the last 8 years or so with the Modi government. The Modi government has clearly characterized, has articulated more explicitly the idea that China is a rival to India, as have many other countries in the same time frame. And when you're talking now about the ideas of a growth in national capacity and the need to secure sea lines of communication, the need to secure energy and broader interests, it sounds like that should be one of the main prisms through which India sees China. But I want to ask you, as the Indian government has recently identified China as a key competitor, national competitor, how important is the Indian Ocean in that broader competition between India and China as countries? When you compare the Indian Ocean with other parts, either sort of functionally or other parts of the world, like Southeast Asia, like the border, like the Middle East, how important is the Indian Ocean in comparison to those other dimensions of the rivalry?
Thanks, Azhar. I think one part that probably got a bit, I didn't dwell on too much earlier, was I think the other logic that was happening, and this again Raja captures it quite well, is that China is doing the same thing, right? So in a sense, we keep using a lot of academics. I mean, I'm guilty of it. I have contributed pieces where we use the security dilemma kind of framework to understand India-China kind of strategic competition. And to some extent, Raja is trying to say the same thing, right? Because China itself then says, look, we opened up, now we worry about energy resources, so we need to go out further away from, first island chain or second island chain outside East Asia to secure those, and that creates another round of insecurity on the part of the Indian state. So in a sense, the Modi government kind of coming to power, I think most people agree there has been some shift, right? There's one shift. And I think one key shift is the Indian governments before, I mean, let's talk from 1990s up till 2014, have been very cautious, very status quo, very conservative when it comes to talking about use of force. I mean, the Pakistan thing will be different, but even there. But I think with the 2014 coming to power of the Prime Minister Modi's BJP-led government, one thing that you could see quite earlier on was this kind of reassessment of how to deal with China. And I think one strand of that was there must be a clear realization that China is a strategic rival. I think there was a lot of, during Manmohan Singh, there were a lot of analysts, a lot of people observing this, saying that, from day to day, you say, go back to Hindi Chini bye-bye, and then, a lot of flip-flopping. So maybe from 2014 onwards, say, okay, let's treat China as a strategic rival. And so in policy terms, what does that mean? I think one key thing was to say that competition with China will happen, especially in the Indian Ocean region. Largely because I think, as you were mentioning about Indian Ocean, I think Raja has said this, many people have said this, the Indian state traditionally has seen in different circles, right? South Asia as India's sphere of influence, and a bit further up, the Indian Ocean as, India's sphere of influence. And I think, so in a sense, the Indian government sees any kind of Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean as a threat. And so I think the idea was that you will then, compete with China in different realms, diplomatic, economic, political, within the Indian Ocean. But the idea there was then you don't do, the border can be then at least not solved, of course, but just frozen, right? Frozen. You also can do economic relationship. You realize, Arzan, the early 2014 period, the BJP government was actually quite keen to talk about engaging economically with the Chinese government. So the plan was, you deal with them economically, but you act like two rational great powers, right? We compete in other people's backyard, other people in other countries, but on the border, we maintain, some kind of status quo. So I think that, in a sense, that was a kind of shift that you see. Of course, then the problem is that you see a second shift with BJP too, where I think in my view, I think, and the other people who said this as well, I think the great compact that the Indian state wanted to forge with China was not very well received by the Chinese state. So much so that today, I think, Arzan, you follow this as well, there are a lot of Indian analysts within India who say that maybe one way of actually trying to not resolve, but to gain some advantage in the Indo-China border war is to actually initiate a mini conflict with China. I think you heard that view before. And I think the reason there being that compact that India wanted is gone. So now you need to, if there's intrusions, the territory taken away, initiate a mini conflict, because other than that, that is gone. That compact is gone. So I think from the Modi 2 onwards, there was a sense that the compact would, all these Wuhan, meeting together in Wuhan, in Delhi, sitting on swings. I think that didn't really, in the end, you probably like to think that Jaishankar was behind a lot of this thinking about how to do great power, compacts, how to great power create compacts, compete in certain areas, leave certain areas alone. But I think from Modi 2 onwards, I think and especially as the standoffs in Ladakh, the Indian government's public statements about Chinese intrusions in the border. And I think someone like Rohan Mukherjee written before in Asia Policy, I think there's another problem of domestic politics, right? It's the feedback loop, which is dangerous in some level, because if you stand up to China, and standing up to China becomes part of domestic political discourse, and you do it once, you need to do it the second time on the same level, if not higher. And sometimes that can be dangerous, because then you're being pushed by certain domestic factors to take actions which may not be, the most might be somewhat ill-advised on kind of dealing with China.
So there's clearly a lot of extraneous factors that shape and pull and distort the perception of threat, right? Everything from domestic politics to atmospherics. But if you were to be a clear-eyed defense planner in India, and you're looking at the Indian Ocean, and you're seeing the PLA Navy growing with massive shipbuilding, what specifically do you see as the threat from China, the strategic threat? Now, you mentioned, we've already spoken a little bit about the idea of interdicting sea lines of communication, interdicting energy supplies, but that sounds like a pretty warlike situation, right? So let's leave the war stuff aside for a second. But even in peacetime, or in this sort of not war, not peace bit of strategic competition, what is the specific threat that China might pose to Indian interests in the Indian Ocean region?
I think, firstly, I think mental frames are sometimes, obviously very important. You heard this string of pearls kind of discourse before. The Indian government hasn't said that they believe in that. But you also, I think, some notion of encirclement, I think, is prevalent within official circles in India. And again, the notion that especially South Asia outside powers need to stay out. And that's, as you know, a Cold War, from a kind of Cold War mindset. And now the Indian state sees itself as an even more globalized power, right? So South Asia definitely is a place where the Indians cannot contemplate a power, especially a power which it sees as not being friendly towards Indian interests on the border, establishing ports, establishing good relations. We're talking about Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, the whole gamut. And then Pakistan remains an issue. I think the Pakistan issue, to a large extent, is Pakistan has become something which the Indians want to bracket out in terms of regional interactions, right? Put Pakistan in a kind of analytical box, policy box. Pakistan, you just deal with a one-off sui generis kind of response. And if you see the kind of Indian regional responses in BIMSTEC, for example, right? So regionalism in South Asia now happens minus Pakistan. So China's threat on some level is also the proxy problem that is posed. And number two, I think, is China's just mere presence in South Asia poses a problem. I think the third issue, of course, is there is a realization, whether true or not, that American naval presence in the Indian Ocean is undergoing a relative decline, and it will carry on. The state of Diego Garcia is up for grabs. Now, what's going to happen there? And the fact that the US keeps telling, publicly saying, oh, India is a net security provider of net security, basically also hints that the US is quite willing for the Indians to, supply public goods here, stability, sea lines of communication, safety or navigation, all those things that the Indian government increasingly hopes Americans will keep doing, which seems to be something that Americans, in terms, relatively speaking, will be less and less willing and able to do in the Indian Ocean. And if that space is filled by, the Chinese military, so you can understand the kind of threats. And also, I think you're right. I mean, you said something about sea lines and energy supplies. So we talk about China's Malacca dilemma, and I think Raja Mohan talks about India's Strait of Hormuz dilemma, right? Because energy supplies coming from that part. If China decides to has enough naval presence in that region, blockades certain sea lanes. So I think that's the kind of nature of the threat. But that threat I still think is long-term, right? Medium to long-term, not long-term, medium long-term. The border, I think, is the main issue. And I think if I was sitting in Delhi, Chinese intentions are always something everyone is trying to ascertain. And the way China has behaved at the border through Indian lenses is that China is not here to forge any kind of win-win situation with India, right? China intends to make sure, for example, the two-front war, right? So you bog India down there. So I think, and also I think from the Indian establishment, the border war is an example of how China wants, it's an easy way for China to keep India down, right? There's certain advantages at the border, there's certain disadvantages in the Indian Ocean, which, So I think in a sense, that's the kind of threat I think you're looking at from Delhi. Firstly, the presence, and I think I wanted to come to that in a bit, but this is a free-flowing discussion, so I think a lot of times, if you look at the Sri Lanka case and the Maldives case, we can see some type of Cold War kind of mechanisms happening here, where, during the Cold War, regimes were flipped. Domestic politics was interfered, putting together coalitions to beat the Rajapaksas. I mean, there's no open information, but it seems that the Indian intelligence did a very good job in putting warring factions together, or factions that didn't like each other, to then stand up. And then we've seen the result, because those guys couldn't get along, and then that government fell. And in the Maldives as well, you see first one regime will be pro-China, and then there's a reverse in regime. And I think more and more, if you look at Indian Ocean littoral states, domestic politics increasingly is patterned along pro-China or less pro-China parties. So which party is more pro-China? Not saying, so I guess one way to looking at it is that someone is less pro-China, they're probably more pro-India. But that for me is very interesting. The nature of how domestic politics has been increasingly patterned along pro-China, not so pro-China parties. And that allows India and China to then have some space to influence domestic politics, the nature of the democratically elected regime that comes to power. And I think that also points to Indian kind of real sensitivities. If these regimes or these governments are very friendly to China, then Indian influence ends. And when Indian influence ends, Indian interests get hurt, right? I think that's how I would see it.
Yeah. Okay. So this is now we're getting into the really meaty, interesting stuff. And I want to get to this issue. What in my mind I'm calling sort of the modes of competition, right? How is this competition between India and China being played out in the Indian Ocean region? And in my mind, I mean, you could list any number of different ways, but for the sake of simplicity, I want to focus on, let's say, 3 different modes of competition. And I'm going to ask you about each of these. You've already sort of begun talking about one of them. So I want to ask you to complete your thoughts on this one, but also 2 other modes of competition, right? So the first one, which you've already begun talking about, is this issue of, as you mentioned, I think in passing, flipping regimes, right? Or influencing domestic politics in regional states. That's the first mode of competition. The second is military capabilities and military posture, right? To control or to influence what might happen in the region to deter the adversary. And the third is geoeconomics, right? This is the core of the BRI strategy of China to build influence, political influence through economic leverage. So if we think, and there are probably other modes of competition as well, right? So I haven't mentioned, for example, multilateral institutions, which has been in the press the last couple of weeks because of UNGA. But let's just, for the sake of simplicity, say there are 3 key modes of competition in the Indian Ocean between India and China. You've already given a couple of specific examples of the influencing domestic politics in the region. Is there anything more to be said about that one? And if not, then can you also address India's approach to the other 2 modes of competition, military capabilities and posture, and geoeconomics? What are the specific examples that India is actually working along those lines?
Thanks, Arjan. I think so military capabilities and posture, I think, especially after COVID-19, especially after COVID-19, I think one key problem that the Indian state has faced for a while and keep facing is, percentage of GDP which is spent on, not only on defense, but specifically on capital acquisitions, right? We know, you of course also know, whole debate about one rank, one pay, the amount of money that the defense budget is used to pay salaries, etc., and so much, how much is left over for new platform or defense acquisition, which is part of trying to, do naval modernization, etc. I think there is a sense among many observers that the material gap between India and China is growing, and the translation of economic growth to military power will also grow. Right? There's really coming to a point where the Gulf is hard to see India forget about catching up, stopping the rate of how big the Gulf is growing. Right? So if that is the case, then I think one mode of competition has been, and this is India's quite recent, not recent, but strategy has been doing the last few years, which is to look at the maritime realm, look at security, but don't stress military security, right? So I'll give you one example. One problem that India has had, and this we come to adjoining regions kind of discussion, is Southeast Asia's agnostic stance towards the Indo-Pacific. It's been something that the Indian government has concentrated on. Right? So they came up with something called the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, right? IPOI. And the Indo-Pacific Indian Ocean Initiative was announced by Prime Minister Modi at the East Asian Summit, ASEAN-led multilateral institution. And the idea here was, I think the Indian government's prognosis was Southeast Asian countries are a bit awkward or wary about joining any kind of grouping or process in where China is obviously not going to join and it has a military dimension to it, right? So IPOI is supposed to be non-traditional, non-military security, right? So you got, and then they make it quite flexible. Certain countries can sign up to lead certain parts of it. So Japan has, I think, Australia has, I think France is also one of them. And so I think, in a sense, that's quite interesting because say, okay, we're just doing non-traditional security, right? Blue economy, anti-piracy, and the latest one was the maritime domain awareness kind of thing that came up with, which then I think is a large part of it is trying to get as much buy-in from countries, especially in Southeast Asia, because as I said, military capability straight one-to-one, the gulf between India and China is huge. But India has an advantage which China doesn't have, which is India's got a lot of goodwill in the region, especially, you know, in Southeast Asia, because, you know, there is no historical baggage, there is no sense that India is a non-status quo power. So I think, in a sense, that's one kind of mode of competition. If you know, what a kind of arrangements you offer for others to join in. And although you will never say that China cannot join, you know China won't join. Right? China is not going to join IPOI. Anything with Indo-Pacific in the nomenclature, China is not going to join. So this, I think, in a sense, it poses a huge policy problem for Southeast Asian states, right? Because if you say you offer maritime domain awareness as part of IPOI, Southeast Asian states say, well, you know, this is, you know, it's a public good, you know, MDA is good, but we worry about the nomenclature of the Indo-Pacific, right? Singapore especially, depending on which country you look at Southeast Asia, very cagey about anything that got Indo-Pacific, unless the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, because the Americans are in it. So I think that's one way of looking at the mode of competition, offering kind of India, knowing that it doesn't have the kind of military wherewithal vis-a-vis China. The other one is the posture. I think, again, it comes down to capability and how the Indian state functions. I think there have been quite convincing arguments made that at the moment in the Indian Ocean, with China's growing naval footprint, even sea denial by the Indian Navy will be difficult. Forget about sea control, right? At the best is patrolling of India's coastal, maybe territorial sea, push it, maybe EEZ areas. That's I don't think that is what Indian defense planners think is enough, right? So again, the posture is a problem because of the capabilities or relative capabilities. So one way is to then try to keep talking about non-traditional security, which have military implications, of course, right? Anti-piracy, MDA is obviously dual use, right? Maritime domain awareness. So that's one. And then I think your third one was geoeconomics. And again, the BRI thing comes in. I think India has been trying to offer alternatives. I think it's realistic that it cannot offer things on the kind of monetary level that China can. We have the usual problems, and sometimes it's quite easy to just blame the Indian state for not being very efficient. So we got the example of the India-Myanmar IMT, India-Myanmar Thailand trilateral highway, right? Which was, in a sense, for India, a two-in-one kind of thing. Open up India's northeast, the greater trade. So if you believe the modernization argument, if people got jobs, they wouldn't fight the state. That solves one domestic problem. You link up to Southeast Asia, you provide an alternative to connectivity. But of course, that project, as you know, has been bogged down for years. And me and a few colleagues did a project many years ago. And I think part of the problem also is the kind of regime or government change in Myanmar. So I was told that one reason why it's taken quite a long time, one was the Indian government wanted to provide an alternative to the way Chinese projects are done. So you wanted to try to get Myanmar firms, companies, labor to build parts of the IMT road that goes into Myanmar. The problem there was, it was difficult to find first companies in Myanmar who could take on a project of that level and all the bureaucratic mess that went with it. Number two was the problem of the bridges. So you have these World War II bridges which the roads to cross. And of course, they need to be redone. And I think the earlier, before Aung San came to power, of course, now she's gone, the agreement was that that would be paid for by the Myanmar government, while the Indian government would build the road. So when Aung San's government comes to power, they say, oh, we don't have the money, you got to build the road, the bridge as well. So you got a situation where the roads are built and the bridge isn't, there's another road that's built and the bridge isn't. So I think those are some of the issues the Indian government faces. Chabaha Port, of course, you know, fair share of problems as well. So I think there is competition in terms of the geoeconomics, but the idea here is to, number one, offer alternative ways of doing stuff. So transparency, using local human resources. And the third, of course, is India is able to leverage, trying to leverage jointly with Japan, US, Australia to offer. So the AAG, is it Asian African Growth Corridor? I think AAGC or something. So again, I think there's a couple of countries coming together, right? Offering alternatives. So I think in the sense that there is some India's offering alternatives. If I can just slightly go off a slight tangent, because it just came to me. I think the other issue sorry, I keep talking about Southeast Asia because I'm from there. And also Southeast Asia, there are 4 Southeast Asian countries which are part of the Indian Ocean as well. One key problem is, for a long time, I think Southeast Asian countries kept saying that India doesn't do enough, west of the Straits of Malacca, right? However, when piracy went up in the Straits of Malacca the last time, and they had what we call coordinated patrols, right? Malacca Straits Patrol, MSP, India offered to do coordinated patrols. This time it was the Southeast Asian countries, not Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, because of traditional positions that they held about the nature of the Straits of Malacca and Singapore, who got cold feet, right? Because India's, I think, kind of logic was quite good, I thought, that if the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are at the mouth of the Straits of Malacca, then India is, to some extent, a stakeholder in non-traditional security in the Straits of Malacca, right? But of course, we had a lot of problems because the Indonesians and Malaysians, although wanting India in, couldn't abandon their, traditional positions on international streets, etc. So I think there also, I think there's a slight shift, maybe 10, 15 years ago, you'd be surprised if the Indian government offered to do coordinated patrols in the Straits of Malacca. But the fact that they did and kept asking, and Southeast Asian countries say, hey, whoa, that's quite fast. We didn't realize that you. So I think that again is interesting how India tries to do stuff in, on the kind of Eastern Indian Ocean, in the Straits of Malacca into the East Asia.
So this is very interesting because you've raised a couple of issues that I want to follow up on. When we talk about these different modes of competition, You've alluded to a few strengths that India has when you talk about, the lack of baggage in Southeast Asia, the political receptivity to India across the region. But also you've alluded to a couple of constraints that the Indian government has to operate under, right? A lack of resources, a lack of material resources. And this is a debate, the latter, the issue of constrained resources really gets to a really fine point when, in the past month, when the Indian aircraft carrier, the indigenously built Indian aircraft carrier, was launched, which sort of revived debates about whether the Indian Navy should pursue a carrier-centric Navy in the Indian Ocean or not. It leads to the question, in my mind, of what is the optimal weighting of these different modes of competition for India, right? So, as you said, it does indeed pursue military capabilities and posture, but even more broadly, as you corrected me, I think security, non-military security, I think is a better way to think of it. On the other hand, the sort of geo-economic dimension seems to be a little bit underdone, at least when we compare it to China. And then there's the piece that we have not come back to yet, which is the sort of influencing domestic politics in countries around the region. When you look at India's national strengths, right, which include things like its political ties across the region, and when you look at India's national constraints, like resource constraints, has India optimized how it competes with China? When you look at these three different modes of competition, is there a way that India could play to its strengths more? Is there a way that India could offset its resource shortfalls more effectively? I mean, taking the US, for example, everyone loves to say correctly that the US overweights its military presence, its security presence in the Indo-Pacific, and underdoes its economic and political development in the region. Does India suffer a similar sort of lopsidedness in its strategy, albeit not on security, but on any other element? And where can India optimize its competition in the region?
So, really good question, Rajan, because I think as you were saying it, I was thinking about some of the debates that have been going on in the last 2 or 3 years about India and modes of competition and what can India do, what are its strengths. So of course, I mean, resource capability, domestic, how much of GDP spend, etc., etc. That's one big problem. But I think on some level, there's another kind of, again, this vantage point from Southeast Asia. There's one concern, this one development that concerns Southeast Asia in the last 2 years, which sort of started off with India pulling out of RCEP. There is a perception that this, Atmanirbhar, this self-sufficiency discourse, is a step back for India when it comes to engaging with the rest of the region, at least Southeast Asia and East Asia. Because the RCEP thing was a huge blow, a huge blow. I think the country most disappointed was Japan. Japan went way out of its way to try to get India to sign on. And the fact that it didn't, that's one problem. So again, things that was seen as India's advantage, because economic engagement with India doesn't bring the same kind of trepidation that increasingly economic engagement with China does, right? So we hold the debate over 5G, the debate about debt trap diplomacy in investment. So I think that's one issue, right? So that puts India, so people are concerned, right? That is India turning inward again, right? And of course, I think Indian state tried to explain, Indian officials said, we are open to investment. So again, you get the sense that if you bring money into India, it's fine, but India is not willing to engage in kind of these things like regional economic arrangements. For Southeast Asia, that is key. The way to manage regional relations is to tie as many countries into deep cross-cutting regional economic relationships. That's the ASEAN way, right or wrong? It's not a normative question, but that's how Saudi Asians think about bringing great powers in. That's why there's a concern, similarly, that there is very little economics, like you say, Arzan, in the US, in the Indo-Pacific, right? So recently, when Southeast Asian prime ministers, leaders went to DC, one of the things that was the IPEF, right? And even though there's nothing in it, there's a skeleton, Saudi Asian countries are very happy. Saying, all right, just, this is a start. And I think the worry is that America's kind of slide inwards in terms of, there's a bipartisan consensus that trade liberalization cannot happen for a while in the US. And somehow India is following that pattern, is again eroding one of the strengths that India had, according to like places in South Asia see it. So I think that is downplaying its strength. Of course, the other kind of things that the strengths are, as I said, if you look at, we keep thinking about Modi's kind of how he's changed India's foreign policy posture. But you look at how India has done, readjusted its relationships on the West, on its West, right? Countries in the Gulf, the Middle East. It's a significant change, though, right? I mean, this is a huge, diplomatic victory, especially for a country who domestically has increasingly be accused of being a Hindu majoritarian government. Then reaching out and successfully reaching out and getting to Israel at the same time as getting to Saudi Arabia and Oman. I think that, so again, that is for India, I think, the kind of forte, because it doesn't come with as much resource demands as, a military, building a port, building 3 highways or something. But yet it gives India the kind of political familiarity, if not India becoming first mover, at least making sure that India is in the mix politically in those countries. So when those countries make decisions about apportioning, making votes at the UN, thinking about giving China an option to build strategic infrastructure, Indian concerns at least would be considered. So I think those are the kind of advantages that India still has. It's still doing very well, I think, on its West.
That's actually, you raised a really interesting way to think about it, about how India's latent and recently mobilized political connections with so many of these countries give it a vote in what these countries do. And that actually leads to the last question I've got for this little section on modes of competition, which is, we've been talking just about India, but we're talking about competition, right? It's only half the story to say what India is doing. So the question I have is, okay, if we've got this mix of policies that India is pursuing, how does that marry up with, or how does that collide with the mix of policies that China is pursuing in the region, which again, as we've noted, has to date been dominated, I think, by geoeconomics. But of course, the other elements are there and possibly may increase in the future. So the question I have for you is similar to the last question about how can India optimize its policy mix. My question is India's approach to competition symmetrical with China's? Does it meet China where China is? Or is it asymmetrical, possibly to India's advantage, in the way that you just mentioned? Are there ways that India can offset its disadvantages to pursue a more asymmetric approach to competition with China in a similar fashion to what you mentioned?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I guess one way of answering that question would be to say that India has little choice but to pursue an asymmetrical way of competing with China, because in terms of material or resources, it's, as I said, the Gulf is, is growing. So how does it? My sense is it's come to a point where, on some level, there's exasperation about the border. And I think you sense it in the tone when Jaishankar speaks. That somehow there is there are very few policy options when it comes to the border. Unlike, unless you go with what some people in Delhi say, only way, go big or go home, try. But the problem, of course, is those people who say those things don't have to win elections, because if you try and you don't do very well, then you run for elections next time. And China, like Pakistan, is increasingly becoming, not on the same scale as Pakistan, but China is increasingly becoming a domestic political issue, right? Who is stronger in China? It's a bit like what happens in the US, right? So that's one issue. So asymmetrical, yes, I think that would be part of what Indian state has to do. There's no other choice, right? Because resources are scant. The other thing I think they're really trying to do is to try to find a way in which you can get certain countries, especially Southeast Asia, to buy some of this Indo-Pacific stuff. That is key. Right? That I think is key. The amount of think tank diplomacy that the Indian state has put in to try to sell IPOI, that I think is, and it's an easy buy-in because it's non-military, it's, everyone can do it, IUU fishing, maritime domain awareness, anti-piracy, HADR. But the problem here is, if you look at IPOI, and this just before I can end quite soon, just realize this point, Vietnam made some early noises about being part of IPOI. But I think to date, I may be wrong, Vietnam has not formally joined the IPOI kind of initiative. That again speaks to the difficulty of trying to get Southeast Asian countries to get into even non-military security kind of processes in the Indo-Pacific. They're very wary, right? So I think that is something the Indians think that they have a chance, asymmetric, because the Chinese, if the Chinese did that, everyone's like, right? But the Indians do is not that, but it's still, you got to sell me on this one. So I think that's something that they're trying to do, right? It's a lot of that going on. The IPOI is that, it's trying to make it as part of the EAS agenda, it's an ASEAN agenda, then keep saying, whenever convenient and possible, say, oh, we believe in ASEAN centrality as well. And so I think that's probably where some of the attention asymmetrically viewed, the way you phrase it, is where I think they try to put some effort. Could there be, in sense, a good return on the effort put in by the Indian state? You can get Saudi Asian countries to come in on MDA, non-traditional security. Not a bad outcome, I think.
So I don't want to turn this into a discussion about Southeast Asia, but
sorry.
No, it's not you. This is a preface to a question we've received from the audience, just related to what you were just saying. When the IC's poll of elite opinion in Southeast Asia, using that as a data point, or any other data points that you may have, do you think this Indian ploy is getting traction, right? Is this idea of the sort of getting influence on the cheap, and that's a crude way of paraphrasing what you said, is that actually getting traction? Is it working or not?
Thanks. Okay. Let me just, thanks, Arzan. I have one very dear and good friends who work in ISIS, so I want to say that first, qualify. If you look at that ISIS poll, and you look at how the sample is done, if a first-year graduate student did that poll, Azan, you as the supervisor say, I think you really need to. So I think firstly, that poll is problematic. It's not because I mean, the problem of doing this, it's a self-selecting sample, right? It's sent email out to, and it's also, and again, it's sent to academics who work in think tanks. I mean, so again, I know the people I see who take umbrage when I say this. The poll is, it's not, it doesn't say much though. Second thing about, I think Indian and influence, I don't think, and I say it's a ploy, I think this is India's strength, right? India is seen in a very positive light outside South Asia, right? Right? Maybe not in South Asia, but everywhere else, India doesn't have baggage, right? Japan has still some baggage in Southeast Asia, China has baggage, the Americans have baggage in some parts of the world, but the Indians have that sweet spot where they don't have much baggage, right? And they're seen relatively, in a positive light. Now, how that is going to be used to further, by you're talking about the Indian Ocean states, how that has been used increasingly, I think the problem there is that if you don't look at South Asia, now we look at the Western Indian Ocean, right? There, I think it'll be a continual kind of competition along domestic politics, right? Who gets in? They get out by normal democratic methods. I'm not saying they're filling ballot boxes or anything, but, and then who comes in? But in Southeast Asia, I think one issue is, and this is just, I tell my friends, my Indian friends all the time, you need to be careful about erasing the boundary between people of Indian origin and the Indian state. China is trying to sometimes erase that boundary. And that's not a good thing when it comes to China dealing with these states, right? So that boundary needs to be very important, that people are Indian origin, but there is no link to the Indian state, right? Because they're citizens of a third country. Because once that slippage happens, it creates problems in terms of India's kind of soft power, if you want, great image in Southeast Asia. So I think in that sense, that is something that, I think it's not happened yet. I don't think it probably happen very soon, but it's something to take note of. I think I remember in the US, when Modi went to Madison Square, and it got me thinking, are there American citizens there of Indian origin cheering on Modi, which is fine. But does that create some, domestic vibes about, people's loyalties, etc.? So I think that's, because the Chinese state is trying to do that, right? Azan, that more and more they say that overseas Chinese and the link to the Chinese state, is back to the kind of fifth column debates we had in Southeast Asia during the Cold War, the Great Chinese Revolution abroad, etc. So I think that's something to be concerned about. Not happening now, but
yeah, absolutely.
Sometime.
And in fact, as someone recently said, and now I can't remember who, but that itself is actually quite illustrative of the difference in soft power or receptivity that India and China have. Because if China were to make the same appeals to the Chinese diaspora as openly as the Modi government makes to the Indian diaspora, that would be looked upon quite askance.
True. So there's a reservoir of, exactly. So there's a reservoir of good positive image about India. The problem is that I just sometimes worry that if the slippage happens too often, and then, this gets implicated in domestic debates. Xenophobia is now, anti-foreign sentiment is a global phenomenon, unfortunately. So sometimes you worry about those very difficult domestic debates, sucking this issues, sucking Indian soft power kind of issues into it. So yeah.
Yeah, terrific, terrific. I'm very aware that we're very close to our time limit, so I'm going to ask for two more questions. One,
Okay.
where I want to make it a bit narrower, and then
Okay.
we'll conclude with one that's a bit broader. So the narrower one, and it may be a quick question, is we've been talking this whole hour about the Indian Ocean region as a region, as a sort of undifferentiated, unified whole. But it isn't in reality. In India, there's always debates about the Eastern Indian Ocean, the Western Indian Ocean. In Chinese military thinking, there's a difference between the Northern Indian Ocean and the Southern. So if we sort of pass out the different parts of the Indian Ocean region, right, subregions, are there areas where which India has emphasized for attention, whether it's military or economic or political? And how does this, again, back to the sort of symmetric, asymmetric question, how does this align with what China is doing? Are there areas that are emerging as areas of intensifying competition where both India and China see them as a prize? Or are there early indications that there might be a modus vivendi where one country tries to carve out more influence in one area and the other in the other?
Yeah. So I think that there was this conventional argument that there's very little Pacific in India's Indo-Pacific, and there's this American case. There's very little Indian Ocean in America's Indo-Pacific. I think you wrote a piece along those lines some time ago, I think. But so with China, I think for India, I think the Bay of Bengal is absolute prime. And then the second tier and also key is right up to the Straits of Hormuz. I think that for in the Indian state that's not negotiable. Problem is that's exactly the same region where China's westwards expansion is happening, right? For China's own reason, trying to build oil or gas pipelines through the Myanmar's coast right up to Yunnan, bypassing Malacca, energy lines. So I think this both suffer from the same kind of like worries. So they end up competing in the same two sub-regions. India's influence in East Asia, of course, is military, at least is marginal. It doesn't have the capability to compete up there. And then more importantly, I think for them, the US is committed there, so it doesn't really make a big difference.
And the last question I have, thank you, Cinder, for tolerating all of these questions.
No, I'm enjoying this. Thank you.
And thank you in particular, because I'm about to ask you a ridiculous question.
Oh dear.
Tying some of these threads together, right? We've been talking about competition mostly, but I wonder, are we creating a self-fulfilling prophecy when we talk about competition? Because, as you just mentioned, right, in East Asia, there is a much more acute, in the first and second, and especially in the first island chain, there's a much more acute militarized competition underway.
Yeah.
That doesn't yet apply in the Indian Ocean. So the big broad question is, are we bound for militarized competition in the Indian Ocean region, or is there a way that India and China and the United States, I guess, but primarily India and China, can find a pathway towards strategic coexistence in the Indian Ocean region? Big question for your big concluding thoughts.
No, I think you're right. And people have made the point that, for all the talk about strategic competition in the Indian Ocean, maritime territorial disputes like you have in the South China Sea, which, at any moment, one wrong move, misunderstanding, and things go off. But I think the problem in the Indian Ocean is 2 or 3 things are happening at the same time. American relative withdrawal, but maybe retrenchment slowly. Again, Diego Garcia, whatever happens, Diego Garcia is going to be key. China moving into that area, and India still regarding that area as a place where it is first among equals, right? And I think those things coming together make, I'm not sanguine about finding where you're going to find some kind of compact where people say, I think we can, one idea, of course, I think long time ago, a couple of us, because, yes, sometimes we just crazy like that. We had something with IORA, and I said that, what IORA can do is they got a troika of past, present, and current chairman. What IORA also can do is take one key state in every sub-region, because not every state is interested in the whole Indian Ocean, right? But key states are, right? So one key state for every sub-region, Australia, India, UAE, South Africa, put them together and then put the US and China as key observers. And that's maybe one way in time of, and then, the Indian delegate said there's no way India will ever allow China to be part of such an important kind of body within. And of course, the idea this is a concert of powers, etc., etc. So, but therefore, I'm not very sanguine about where you're going to find. And I think the Indian state is not really that concerned about that. I think that the idea is that competition will happen. The problem is the border. The border is something the Indian state is concerned about. I think the Indian Ocean competition is something that, is going to happen, right? It's a structural issue. China has to move westwards. India is also growing. The Americans want to slowly retrench. So, yeah, I don't know whether that's a satisfactory answer, but.
Well, it's an answer that incentivizes me to continue this conversation, because I don't think we
let me come to California, then we can do that.
Indeed. Sinder, thank you very much. This has been very, very stimulating, very informative. I think the one key takeaway that you have underscored for me in many different ways, through many different answers through this past hour, is that the Indian Ocean is not the same as the rest of the Indo-Pacific. It's not the same as the first island chain. India's position on the Indian Ocean region, towards the Indian Ocean region, has evolved significantly in the last few decades and probably will keep evolving. And this is not sort of predetermined, right? The trajectory is not fixed. So I think there's a lot of scope for creative scholarship on this and creative policy action. So thank you very much, Sinder. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.